Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into leadership through a lens that might just completely shatter your current perspective. We're talking about the power of surrender. When we think of history's absolute greatest and most impactful leaders, we usually picture them conquering, dominating, and basically bending the world to their will, right? Well, the historical data we're looking at today reveals a completely counterintuitive premise. It turns out the absolute greatest leaders didn't just conquer, they actively surrendered. Let's explore exactly how they did it and honestly, why you should too.
So does surrender mean defeat? Be honest with yourself for a second. When you hear that word, you probably picture weakness or throwing in the towel. In our modern culture, surrender is almost always tied to losing. But today, we're going to directly challenge that preconceived notion. Because as you'll see in the context of transformational leadership, surrender is literally the ultimate power move.
Okay, let's dive into this comparison. The old, negative idea of surrender is basically giving up responsibility or authority, but that is definitely not what we're talking about here. The true leadership definition is yielding your ego, your need for control, and your self-interest for a much higher purpose. It's an active choice. It's not a passive collapse. You aren't giving up your goals. You're actually just getting out of your own way so those goals can finally be achieved.
To really ground us, let's officially define a surrendered leader. This is someone who listens way more than they insist and serves rather than dominates. This kind of leader depends heavily on local partners, supporters, and volunteers through deep, genuine collaboration. They trust others, they accept their own limits, and, crucially, they're willing to change course when wisdom or truth demands it. They always place the mission above their personal recognition. And it's also worth noting that in faith-based contexts, this kind of surrender means submitting decisions to a higher will. It's a total reorientation of where a leader's power actually comes from.
Here's our quick roadmap for this explainer. First, redefining leadership surrender. Second, Mandela and surrendering resentment. Third, Gandhi and surrendering ego. Fourth, Lincoln and surrendering pride. And finally, putting it all together with the surrendered leader. Let's jump right into our first historical proof point, Nelson Mandela and surrendering resentment.
To truly understand the gravity of this, we've got to set the heavy context here. Nelson Mandela was released after 27 long years in prison. Let that really sink in for a second. Decades of his life completely stolen. Upon his release, he had every single right, both emotionally and politically, to seek retribution against his oppressors. But instead, he invited his former jailers to his inauguration. He actively formed a government of national unity that included the very people who had oppressed him. Mandela made the conscious, incredibly difficult choice to surrender his personal anger for the much higher goal of national reconciliation. By surrendering his ego and those very justified grievances, he quite literally prevented a civil war.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the profound self-awareness it reveals. Mandela deeply understood a crucial psychological truth. He just couldn't effectively lead a new nation if he remained a victim of the old one. He realized that holding on to his resentment would be a mental prison far stronger than the physical bars he had just walked behind. He knew he absolutely had to surrender the past to lead the future.
Moving to our second case study, Mahatma Gandhi and surrendering ego.
Gandhi's entire philosophy of satyagraha, which translates to truth force, was fundamentally rooted in surrendering self-interest. He willingly gave up the high-status comforts and the absolute safety of being a Western-educated lawyer to live completely as a peasant. He actively aligned his physical existence with his message. And this wasn't just some symbolic gesture. It was a total surrender of his physical safety. He frequently undertook fasts unto death, essentially surrendering his very life to appeal to the conscience of both his followers and his fiercest opponents.
People follow those who have nothing left to lose. When a leader voluntarily surrenders their personal safety, their wealth, or their status for a cause, something incredible happens. They gain this unshakable, untouchable moral authority. Their power no longer comes from a fancy title or wealth. It comes entirely from their absolute surrender to the mission.
Which brings us to our third prime example, Abraham Lincoln and surrendering pride.
During the American Civil War, Lincoln provided an absolute masterclass in surrendering the very human, frankly very toxic need to be right. He deliberately filled his inner circle with his bitter political rivals. He even recruited Edwin Stanton, a guy who had publicly and viciously insulted him, famously calling Lincoln the original guerrilla. And this brilliantly illustrates his mindset. He focused strictly on finding the best minds for the country, entirely regardless of how they treated him personally. Lincoln willingly endured belittlement from his own subordinates because the survival of the Union just mattered far more than his personal pride.
Surrendering the need to be the smartest person in the room is what actually allows a leader to harness the collective intelligence of a team. Think about your own workplace or community for a second. How often does a leader's ego completely stifle the best ideas? Lincoln's team of rivals proves that when we drop our ego and stop needing to be the one with all the answers, we unlock the full, raw genius of the people around us.
Let's move to our final section and see how this builds into actionable takeaways for the surrendered leader. Synthesizing these towering historical examples from Mandela, Gandhi, and Lincoln, the core traits of surrendered leadership basically boil down to 4 pillars: humility, courage, clarity, and trust. Surrendering your ego requires profound humility. Stepping away from control and personal safety, that takes immense courage. Keeping the higher purpose above your own personal feelings requires absolute clarity. And relying on others to achieve that mission builds incredibly deep trust. True leadership isn't about dominance at all. It's about using these 4 traits to create an environment that actually empowers everyone else to flourish.
So, what ego or pride do you need to surrender to lead better today? Whether you're leading a nation, a business, a family, or hey, just leading yourself, look closely at where your need for control, your resentment, or your pride is holding you back. The ultimate power doesn't come from gripping tighter. It comes from learning to let go. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you take this challenge with you into your week.